And welcome back to V-Road, TCG's weekly Vanguard podcast. I'm Cole.
And I'm Trey.
And today we're doing another one of our nation know-hows about, I think, Trey's favorite nation, I think?
I think I would have to say yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we both kind of share respect for Brandgate, but after that I think we kind of deviate, and I'm more Keter and you're more Dragon Empire. But...
Yeah, for sure. Dragon Empire's been my day one, so it's kind of hard to also just say no to playing dragons. Like, dragons are pretty sick.
Yeah, especially because you started the game with Overlord and all that, and he kind of embodies, at least back in the old Vanguard, what the Dragon Empire as a nation was. Everything kind of branched off of him with the retire and whatnot.
Yeah, so, yeah, definitely we'll have to say it's my favorite for sure.
Yeah, so these are, like I've said a couple times now, I think, these are supposed to be tools for people who don't know much about the nation to kind of gauge how they feel about all the individual decks in them, and kind of look back at how well they've done over time, how well they were when they came out, and what they're doing today. So we'll just go ahead and start with, the very first one, the original protagonist of the D series, which is Nirvana. And I remember when this deck came out, it wasn't very good. It was like, okay, kind of middle of the pack.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously sought after because, well, the game just came out, and it had a really new mechanic that we had never seen, at least to my knowledge, really in standard, like, or just in Vanguard, other than like striding. Striding kind of had a similar effect where you got, your heart card and your stride and so on and so forth, but having your original dress and your overdress, like it added in an entirely new mechanic that people tended to flock towards just to kind of, get with the new type thing. And it's the main character's deck. A lot of people are going to play him because, it's going to get support.
Yeah, it kind of fed on the thing that Digimon had really well, which was the, like mascot character kind of looking guy who got bigger and like had cooler forms he could go into. And I think this deck at first wanted to try to make Trickstar into like a little toolbox that you could go into whatever you needed, like a big beater, or you can draw 2 cards with him, or you can happen to restand him. As far as like set 1 goes, you had 3 big options. And then I know that it kind of deviated towards like other ways of getting multi-attacks. Like you had the grade 2 in set 2 that could overdress onto Trickstar in the battle phase, and there was a lot of stuff trying to make Trickstar himself big. But they went like a lot of different directions, and I can like say with confidence that this deck wasn't much of like anything competitively until set 4 when it got its grade 4. And its grade 4 was actually very sweet because it was, I believe, the first deck in standard that could do effect damage.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I believe that is correct as well. So it was kind of just nice, and having a grade 4 13k still, but getting an additional drive each turn, and you essentially just got the same effect that you did as Nirvana, but slightly better, at least in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, it had no downsides. It was only a positive thing to add. Obviously, it's more cards in your hand that were not guard, but once you were on it, you were kind of set.
Yeah, and you always had to fight against the inherent disadvantage of needing to make one strong rear guard out of multiple cards. And you had to do it in the same timing as like a normal call, so there was no like they've still never done this. Like, they've never made a card that like searches your deck and overdresses from the deck. Like, I bet they could, honestly. I don't think that would be too bad, especially for the next incarnation of this deck that we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, it always fought against just the idea of needing to commit a lot to one strong rear guard, but at least it did get a really good one with the grade 4 that just stands itself for a Soul Blast. And yeah, I think it kind of fell off after that, but that's just because it kind of became something else later. So
Yeah, it went into its next form, which we're gonna talk about soon.
Yeah,
Or next soon.
soon.
And it really fell off after that, unfortunately. But at the time, especially when it got its grade 4, it was very good.
Yep. And then immediately in the same set as it, we got one of the most infamously bad decks in probably all of Vanguard at this point, which was Eugene. And I don't know if we really should like dwell on this guy that much. He's just not good. He's not a good deck. He focused on retiring the opponent's rear guards, making sure they just had an empty board, and then you got some pretty good benefits off of your opponent having an empty board, but getting there was always the hard part. Like, there was always a scenario where you were off by 1 rear guard or 2, and you just couldn't do what you needed to do to be, like, decent. Not even good, but just decent.
Yeah, I mean, it had Soul Blast 5 on it, so that if that tells you anything about set 1, it wasn't great. I mean, yes, it did have the advantages of once you retired a full board of your opponent, it was hard for them to recover, especially Nirvana, because they're committing 2 things to a single circle. If they full the board, they're committing at least 5, 6, 7 cards at a time. So it just got okay effects and did all right things, but never really went anywhere from that. So
yeah, it kind of went all this way and the other with its support. Just a bunch of stuff that retired and soul charged or went kind of net like a wash on card advantage any way it could. But I know now it's gotten a new form that's coming out in set 5 that we also don't really have much to say on because we haven't played with it, and we know what it does, and it is a better card than this, but I think it's kind of trapped in a scenario where the support it has is better than the deck it was made for, but now that like the boss unit has like caught up to everything else, it still kind of keeps it behind of like this card being only so good as it was means that its support could only be so much better than it. So I think it'll just always stay in this weird spot for Overdress.
Well, it unfortunately has the disadvantage of competing with its rear guards for another deck that just generically has a better Vanguard. So yeah, it kind of just loses out in a lot of places. So we'll get to him later though. So,
but next one we've got is one we have at least a little bit more to talk about, at least a little. And that's the Feller, the Dragonic Overlord.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an all right. No, it's a really fun, good deck. It's a pretty piece heavy reliant deck, especially when it got its new form of the end. But going back to the roots, it did do pretty good about sticking to what Dragonic Overlord did in previous iterations. Attacking a rear guard, restanding, and attacking Vanguard again, so you're still getting those drive checks, even though they may be against a rear guard or whatever on the first attack. But they couldn't guard that attack, so you were guaranteeing killing something each turn, which was pretty alright, as long as they had something on board, I should say. So it did pretty good. Its support has always been pretty alright. It's pretty much maintained its same support throughout, other than 2 promos that you have to run. But yeah, very good deck. Love it a lot.
Wow, you had a lot of self-restraint there. No, but yeah, from what I've noticed, yeah, the deck has always been super piece reliant, and it needs to get the original Overlord in Soul, and also make sure that the amount of cards it's discarding from its hand gets used somewhere. I've always noticed that, like, all the cards I discard in that deck that want to be discarded will either like call themselves out or go into Soul or something. So like it feels like just a early version of a deck we'll get to near the end of the video. Yeah, after that we had, I believe it was Tamayura, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think so. I don't think there was much for Dragon Empire between
Bob
Overlord.
Saga.
Bob Saga. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Man, if that says anything about that deck. Oops. Okay. Yep. Bob Saga. In set 4. Yeah. Wow. That's funny. So. Okay. So. If you don't know, this is the one of the few decks in Dragon Empire that care about using orders, and she has her own that kind of equipped to her, like little equipment in like Magic or something. And when she came out, she was actually a very good deck in the set 4, the early set 4 meta. She was actually a very strong deck because she had like extra drive checks. She could deal damage. She had a guard restrict. That wasn't like the best, but you did run it, and you had a really, really good booster in Trick Moon.
Yeah, I mean, it's the three attack queen. She's the best at it of all the 3 attack decks. Well, I say that. It's got a new, there's a new one who just came out recently in Paldio. That's a different story. But no, she hasn't changed much, and unfortunately hasn't gotten a lot of support. Which is a little sad. She did just recently get a 4th attack for the deck, which is pretty all right. So finally, it's going to do something a little bit more. We'll see how much it really affects the deck. Very good when it came out, fallen off in the times.
Yeah, that's just kind of it. Also one of those decks that, come from the anime as much as like Overdressed Nirvana did. And it's had its staying power through that, at least. And I think what we'll like come to see a pattern is there's a lot of really solid anime decks that just have a lot of like memorable characters tied to them, which we can't say about Tamira, but she is a really solid deck in a general sense, just because she's a glitter deck. So like all the other ones, she's had her whole deck reprinted in Triple Drive, and the whole packages are relatively cheap for anybody who wants to get into the game or the nation. While not necessarily doing something super Dragon Empire-y, like you're pretty much playing a Darkseid deck, if I'm being honest. But at least you're doing so and saying you have a Dragon Empire deck, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really play like a Dragon Empire deck. It is very fun, and yes, Triple Drive helped it out a lot because it was a really ridiculously expensive deck that was just pretty all right. But since Triple Drive, them reprinting the forms, adding the new form in set 13 or 11, whatever it was, and adding in a promo just a couple months ago that made the deck all the better. It's in a really decent spot, and I still like it. It still sneaks out a lot of wins currently. Like, I wouldn't say a lot, maybe, but it can sneak out some good wins.
Yeah, it's one of those piece reliant decks that once it gets all of its pieces, it's kind of set for the rest of the game, and then the kind of pressure it puts out is strong enough that against the wrong hands that maybe only even have like one perfect guard, that's enough for it to just take it in some regards. And that's something we can't say about most of these decks, at least early on in their lives. But I think the spot that Tamira is at, it's right next to all the other glitter decks. Like, they're nothing that'll do a ton for you competitively, but they'll be excellent teaching tools for a lot of like core mechanics of the game.
100% agreed.
Yep. So, and then I believe after that was Shoujo Doji, right? I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Ooh, actually, I think first was Nirvana Jiva.
Correct.
So.
Yes, and Shoujo. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Jiva being the alternate form of Nirvana, so added in a new mechanic, which this is still the more played version of the deck, and there are still people who run it because it still is just pretty all right. It added in a grade 3 cross-dress unit late in Overdress, and it's just kind of maintained. It's not ever fantastic, but it's never bad. Like, it's always just a consistent middle ground that can have some high tops if it's like, everything goes to plan. So
yeah, I think it's like the epitome of a reliant deck in Vanguard. sort of like, I guess if you want to equate it to anything else, it's sort of like a combo deck where you need to see a lot of specific cards to mount your pressure for the turn and make some big flashy plays, because this deck can get like 5 attacks and it can get a lot of power. It can give its Vanguard triple drive even though it's a grade 3, and while it does need even more cards to commit to one rear guard, what it got in set 13 last year made it actually fairly consistent at getting enough pieces to at least cross overdress a couple of times per game, and that's all that you really need. So I think what I would just sum it up with is just, it's solid. It's just fairly solid despite how it may seem.
Yeah, 100%. And it's Phoenix, kind of gets away from the dragon side of everything, but it's fun still, nonetheless.
Yeah, but then we get into like the, what we haven't really seen much with Dragon Empire, except with maybe like Tamayura, and that's like the whole ninja side of thing, all the stealth guys, all of the stuff that cares about the soul, weirdly enough, and also the bind zone. Not much bind zone stuff really. And then we finally got that with Shoujodoji, and I don't know, he's a bit too much for me, if I'm being honest. Especially now.
He old form Shoujodoji felt like he was in a really decent spot when he came out. Like, it did enough game actions to be a challenging deck to play, but not overly difficult to master. In a sense, like if you wanted to run it at a base level, you could. And then it got a promo that gave it another attack, and it just got all the better. So it was like 4 or 5 attacking almost every turn. So it's fairly consistent once you got your pieces kind of set up. But again, kind of piece reliant in that early phase too. You have to see them, and then you got to set your soul up, and then you got to set your bind up, and did quite a lot, but it was pretty decent. Kind of fell off just a little bit because of the amount of time and game actions that it took. And then they released the new form that, well, almost felt like it doubled the game actions, but made it like 3 times better. So, the new form Shoujodoji is just really, really good to this day.
Yeah, and he's a pretty recent upgrade. I think when this deck came out, it started as something that kind of wanted to do the same thing over and over as much as it could, which was get out a specific rearguard that could get pretty big and help you draw cards by like binding it and then calling it from the bind zone when he attacked. And that's how it started. What it got over time with the amount of promos and support it got leading up to and following after its new form is it kind of made it kind of a toolbox. Like, you have a card that can guard from the bind zone, and a card like Trey mentioned that can call itself from the bind zone when you call something else from the bind zone, or when you bind one of your opponent's rearguards, which I think we didn't mention that this is one of the few decks that disrupts the opponent's hand in Standard. Like, this new form can make your opponent have to bind a card from their hand, and as well as 2 other rearguards on their board, which they'll get back later, back to their hand, kind of resembling like super old, like Nubatama kind of style of play. But then it just had a bunch of cards that would like bot deck on a card in the opponent's bind zone, and so they couldn't get it back to their hand. And that kind of gave it, like, it's got a lot going on. I think I do respect people who play it, because I feel like it's one of the decks that you have to play a lot to kind of get down.
Yeah, I'd say maybe right now it's probably the most thought-provoking deck in the game currently. There are a lot of games that you can turn, or a lot of decks you can turn your brain off with, but Shoujodoji you can't. If you misstep once, it hurts. So, people who take it to tournaments, mad respect.
Yeah, it's like one of those decks that has a lot that it asks of the player to optimize, like the resources it needs to manage and the bind zone that it needs to have to do what it needs to do. So you'll always see like the really competitively minded players pick up the deck. It's one of those kinds of decks that just kind of falls into the laps of the players who want to feel like they're optimizing all their plays and where they can be really confident in their wins. So, and that's like your kind of thing. I don't think he's even that expensive either. Weirdly enough, I don't think he ever has been.
He did for a minute there when he was first coming out. Some of his older cards, like Unprecedented, shot up to like, I think it was like $20-$30 at one point. I don't know what he's at. I haven't really looked at his prices lately. I have the deck, so I haven't really looked, but yeah, it's a good deck. That's all I gotta say.
Okay. There might be too much to say about this next one, because it's a little infamous in all the wrong ways. That's Gandiva. So this is, in my opinion, the worst designed deck in Vanguard, period. Like, ever. Like, I do not think that this deck was designed with much thought to balance and much thought to overall gameplay. Like, it feels like the idea of a deck where you can't play around it. The point of the deck is it can't be played around in any way, shape, or form. That's not fun. That can't. I think that can't be fun. So if something like that can't be fun, then it's bad design to make it. You know, that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean,
like,
it's
a little harsh, but
a little bit. But if there's anything to be said, well, I was gonna say it's the only deck that has a restriction, but it's not. There's 2 Dragon Empire decks that have a restriction, but it is one of them that one of its single rares is so good that you can only run a 1 of it. So if that tells you anything about the deck, there's that. But yeah, it was probably, I mean, other than Shiranui, it was probably the strongest deck out of the box. Like, if you just took all of its support in the set that it came out and you just threw it together in set 10 and ran it did what it wanted. It won you games. There were some things you could throw in it to make it slightly better, but not really. It was so good to the point that people traded out their Persona rides, which every deck runs because they want that extra power, for more consistency and different binding effects and retiring effects and drawing effects, that they didn't need it because the amount of power that Gandiva gave was more than enough than needing a Persona ride.
Yeah, they've revisited the concept of of power scaling over the course of a game outside of like stride decks with decks like Impaldio, but they really thought about that deck a lot more, especially in how its gauges need to be made from receiving damage and having cards in your drop zone to make into gauges. And then you're only getting, like, you're not getting 2k for every single gauge you have. You're getting 5k for every 2, which, you know, it's a really small thing. Like 3 gauges is 6k, or sorry, three face down bound cards in Gandiva is 6k, and then 3 gauges in Impaldio is 5k. But the rate at which this deck could bind things face down from its own drop zone was really, it felt like a mistake. Like, it felt like no deck should be able to turbo through its own mechanic that quickly, especially when at the end of the day none of it would have felt as bad if it wasn't so prominent how much the cards were designed to never be played around. Like, it was one of those decks that bordered on the Gandiva talking about how much I misplayed here, or, you know, I should have done this, or maybe next time I'll try to do this, and maybe I'll get 30k to my front row instead of 28. You know, like it matters. like either way, there isn't really much to really talk about as far as this deck. Like, it's nuts and bolts, because it's really just not interesting. But it is very strong, and I believe it is pretty cheap, actually, extremely cheap.
Yeah.
So if you don't, it's it's gonna be super harsh to say, but if you don't care about what the other guy's doing at all, and you don't want to care, and you don't want to try to care, and you want to do something super one-sided, and that's just how you roll, then go crazy. You know, it's I will say, at least today, in today's world, it's a little less egregious than it used to be, because there's a lot more defensive options in the game.
Yeah. It's one of the most infuriating decks to play against because it doesn't fail to do what it wants to do. All of the cards in that deck, for some reason, have fail safes built into them. Like Counterblast, retire a unit, and like, you know, the whole point of that card is to retire a unit. And then it's like, oh, if you don't retire, bind a card face down, draw a card. Or, you know, a lot of like combinations of things like that where like, oh, if you whiff on a retire, you get this, when the entire effect really should just be the retire. Or it should be the bind and draw. Like, it shouldn't be both. Like, it shouldn't have do this, or if it fails, do this. Like that's part of the most infuriating part of it is it always is going to do something with every single effect. At least it feels like.
Like, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in a vacuum. But when every single card has that, you know, it compounds onto itself over time, and you're like turn 4 and they Persona Riot and they have like 30k to their front row somehow, and it's a 5 attack deck. It's a very consistent 5 attack deck because the amount it draws means it'll always find its grade 2 that can give you more attacks. So I don't know. I think we can go on all day about it, but we can go on to the very opposite end of the spectrum and talk about a really bad deck. Not quite Eugene, not nowhere near Eugene level, but Dragonic Kaiser of Vermilion definitely suffers from similar problems.
Yeah, its whole kind of aspect is like using its Narukami keywords and doing a damage to your opponent, but half the time you only ever get to use that skill once a game, maybe, and it's not like enough to really warrant it, and everything else is just like kind of mediocre. Like, you're soul blasting 2 to maybe retire a back row unit, you're counter blasting 1 to give like 5k to your unit, and you draw a card, and like it feels like it does a lot, but it does a lot of actions to do a lot of mediocre things, it feels like. So it kind of just suffers a little bit because of that.
Yeah, I think they forgot to print like any amount of card advantage on these guys. It feels like
it runs out of that real fast.
Yeah, like its biggest flashiest thing it can do is deal a damage, which is very rare in the game. But it needs to discard and it needs to hit, I think. No, just at the end of the battle it attacks, and it needs
if they're 4 or less.
Yeah, and you need to have played a normal order that turn, which you do want to play anyway. Without the order, I believe you don't actually bind any of your opponent's stuff after you retire them. You just retire them. And in some matchups, that's pretty relevant. So,
yeah.
I don't know.
It's an odd one, for sure.
Yeah. It's Narukami. It's like 2011 Narukami and 2014 Vanguards. Or 2024 Vanguard. Wow. But after that, I believe we had Tamayura's new form, and then we had not a lot of stuff until Divines.
There was Zedlance who came out in Triple Drive.
True. Okay. Yeah, Zedlance is worth mentioning. He was cool. I had my little stint with him because I really wanted a Dragon Empire deck. So I don't know if y'all know this, but I don't like Dragon Empire that much. Not because I think the nation is bad or anything, but it's just not my flavor. Like, I don't care for dragons that much. I never have. And the decks that have been in Dragon Empire, none of them really speak to me very well. But when he came out, he used set orders to buff things. And I just thought that was kind of neat, because I'm a big Brancade guy, so set orders have usually always found its way into every deck I play, whether it started that way or not. But I think he's just fine. I don't know. I don't have a ton. He's just fine.
Yeah, he's just fine. He hasn't gotten a lot of support, which is unfortunate. they kind of, well, unfortunately, he also is very underwhelming because he came out at the same time as another deck that does just better things than him at grade 3. Whereas Zed Lance is so specific about having 3 of his armories in the or blacksmithy in the order zone, and you can't do that on your first grade 3. Whereas this other deck that came out at the same time can on its first grade 3 turn, and it just like it doesn't do enough even from its set order to really warrant it. So like they kind of screwed it by making it a grade 2 order when it should have probably been a grade 1. But yeah, it just kind of has an underwhelming skills. Like it has a skill on its Vanguard that literally just searches for the order, which like, okay.
And it's only on place.
It's on place. Okay. It can counterblast and restand, lose a drive and get power, but only if you have 3 of the orders and you selected 3 of your other things. So it's like just an all right for attack.
It's even worse than that because like without 3 orders, you can counterblast 1 to get a drive check, which isn't like the worst thing for a grade 3 thing. But when you have 3 orders and you get the drive +1 at the end of the battle, he'll restand with 10k and drive -3. So you don't even get like the payoff is somehow a worse Overlord.
Yeah.
It's insane to think about, but yeah, it's literally a worse Overlord. Like you're getting 3 drive checks, which is not terrible, but you're not getting 4 like Overlord has.
Yeah, it just kind of exists, which whatever.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good way to sum it up. He exists.
He exists.
But then we got the exact opposite in the whole different way, which, well, opposite, but also kind of the same with Varga. Like Varga is. We'll get there. Yeah, but I don't want to touch on Varga first because I know he'll. I've actually had an epiphany about this deck. Because when he came out, he is a very strong deck. Unfortunately, he's not a very cheap deck. But he is a very simple and straightforward deck in like all the best ways, I think. The only thing you need to manage is really your hand and what you're drawing into and how you use what you're drawing into. He has a lot of cards on him that say draw a card. Like after you do something or do this or retire this or that or whatever. He reads like Gondiva, he just plays like Overlord. Like straight up, he just plays like Overlord that happens to be able to have 3 Vanguard swings in 1 turn. Which is good. It's very good. But sometimes you will just die before you get there.
Yeah. He reads and does a lot for kind of, again, not a lot. Like it's very simplistic in what it actually does. It just kind of hits for some mediocre power on its first couple attacks. And then it's really just Vanguard centric and saying, hey, I'm going to try to do all my damage with this card right here. So either PG or throw it on your OT or throw it on some ridiculous shield cards and we'll go next type thing. So yeah, I mean, perfectly fine as is, but nothing to write home about.
Yeah, it's so weird to say that about this deck because he's a deck that at least our locals complains about a lot because of how it. I think what I've learned after playing the deck only even once, just once, like so many things have clicked in my brain for me about this deck, and the big thing is that as much as people complain about it, it comes down to how much the deck can punish the opponent for having suboptimal turns. Like what I've learned is the amount of cards this deck can draw to keep it even in its hand advantage versus like the pressure it's putting out. Like if your opponent has one bad turn where it's not doing enough to slow you down, even a little, like you're going to snowball them because you're going to start, as soon as you lock them into a turn where you can do the Divine Scale and get drive +2 and have 4 total drive checks over the turn without needing to discard for any of them, you're going to have enough of a hand where whatever they throw out, you might just be able to live through and it won't even be close. Like This deck either has huge blowouts that it just kind of capitalizes on the opponent not being able to do much, or it just kind of doesn't get there itself, which is very strange to like finally see in a personal sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's never not going to be bad. Or it's never going to be bad. Sorry, but I think there are still much better decks.
Speaking of never not going to be bad, like you mentioned, yeah, Shiranui skipped over him because sometimes this is one of those decks. Wow, Dragon Emperor just has a lot of those. This is one of those decks I just kind of want to forget exists. Not even because, well, now listen, okay, this is the deck they brought back. They gave it a Stride deck. You know, it's not even like a new D version. They used the old one like they did with all the other Stride decks. And Dominate isn't necessarily an overpowered mechanic, using your opponent's rear guards to attack them and all that stuff. It's just how much they overtuned the deck and the infamy it got with having 2 different restanders and the ability to have like 8 or 9 attacks a turn, and how dominant the deck was competitively. It feels like a mistake. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it has the same problem all Stride decks do, is they get too much power from having G zone units face up, as well as being multi-attacking, so that power is just, you know, really good. So yeah, I mean, I don't think they should have added this deck into Standard.
Ooh, wow, okay.
Personally, I think Dominate was a skill that wasn't necessary, and like the biggest problem is attacking with your opponent's units at your own or like, you know, having my units attack myself is one thing, but it's the fact that it attacks me and it retires, and if it gets like hits and does things, the other person gets effects, or even if they just swing, they get additional effects. Like, it does just a little too much for what it's good for, and that's just how Dominate has always been. So I own the deck. I like it. It's fun. It's dumb.
That's a hot take. I didn't expect you to say that it shouldn't have been in Standard. I won't ever go that far. I just think it didn't need restanders. Like, the whole point of the deck was that its multi-attack came from the opponent's units, and that was it. Like, that's all it needed to be. And I think in the current Standard, where shield value isn't still isn't quite as good as, you know, the shield that Shiranui and decks in its era had access to was much higher. Like, Shiranui came out when G guards came out, and the G zone went from 8 cards to 16 cards, so they had a lot of shield value to play around with. But just Dominate by itself would have been fine, especially since the crest is here and it's never going away. But yeah, I just think they just fumbled with having restanding rear guards. I don't know what they were thinking.
Yeah, who knows?
But you know, at least for players who are getting into the nation or the game and need something out of the box that's more than good enough, you know, we can put it up next on the shelf next to Gondiva. As, you know, if you don't care about what your opponent's doing, or you don't really want to read your opponent's cards, that sounds super mean, but I don't know, you don't really need to care about what your opponent's doing with these 2 decks, and just play something that you know is good and you know will win games and is like built to so explicitly. Then yeah, just pick it up. I don't know if you can find it these days. It's kind of air quote old. It came out this year, but it's kind of, you know, getting a little bit more harder to find.
Yeah, for sure.
But what's not hard to find is Triumph Dragon, the budget deck king, Dragon Empire, I think. Yeah,
I mean it. Well, I think Eugene might still be cheaper, but okay, that's a different story. Sure. But yeah, the trial deck that they introduced in Divines has very similar skills to all the other trial decks, but retires a unit and gets power and critical. So, I mean, probably the most simple deck to understand and to learn from, in my opinion. Maybe Sarvacel, you could say the same thing, where he calls a unit from drop. That's, you know, pretty simple. But if you just kind of want to get a basis of a deck, it's pretty simple. You retire a unit, get power, critical. super easy.
Yep.
So just trial deck, just all right.
Yep, you probably have this guy if you got into the game with like the Dragon Empire startup deck because you just wanted to be like, oh well, I'll have all the triggers and I can build it into some other deck. But you know, if you have enough left over, it's not the worst teaching tool.
And the new promo is actually pretty good. So
yeah. But I think this is the Dragon Empire deck I currently have. Gryandra. Another very, very good budget deck. And one that's like very deceptively good. Like I don't think people talk about this deck that much. For what it does. Like it's not doing anything insanely flashy beyond the novelty of like arresting your own Vanguard in the main phase just to stand it in the battle phase and have a back row swinging rear guard from your ride line. But I don't know. It's another one of those simple Dragon Empire decks that kind of just does something pretty unique, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it unfortunately really truly is like probably the biggest one-trick pony in the game.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, that's fair. No, that's fair.
You're doing the same exact thing every time, but the fact that you're doing the same exact thing every time and you're putting out decent numbers every single time, you can whittle down your opponent pretty good. And it sneaks out wins just by getting rid of hand because you're swinging really like 420 to 20 plus K attacks every single time. And it just got another card in the latest set that gives it guard restrict. So yeah, just pretty all right.
Yeah, really solid. Really also like kind of feeds on that Digimon Frontier part of my brain that I enjoy, where it's like a guy merging with something else, and you know, there's always like the novelty in that I don't think they go into too much with Dragon Empire. It's usually just dragon or guy that's dragon themed. So but to cap it off, Dragon Empire is the newest deck that has come out, which is the Destined one. Ooh, no, Cody Blaze. Gotta touch on Cody Blaze, yes.
Ragilla.
Oh, you're talking about like Ragilla? Okay, sure, yeah. I guess, yeah, we'll go to Cody Blaze first because he did come out only a couple months ago, really. Yeah, he's an interesting one.
Cody Blaze is kind of fun. It's kind of in a weird spot because it really only has like 3 support cards that you actually run. Then the rest of it's just generics. So like Dragon Empire generics that are like, okay, I want to run 4 of this. Okay, I want to run 4 of this. So it's kind of an interesting spot, but it kind of is nice because it has 2 different main Vanguard skills, like when it attacks. So either you're restanding your units or you're restanding your Vanguard. And it's like one or the other, and it's kind of like a semi-divine skill on Cody Blaze. It's not actually, but like it gives an effect that's similar to it with the restanding Vanguard. So it's an interesting one because it kind of plays more with your soul than most decks do in Dragon Empire, so it kind of changes up the limit a little bit, and requires you to have like matching names and things like that. So it's just got an interesting playstyle to say the least.
Yeah. Well, another one of those Dragon Emperor decks that needs you to like manage your resources as well as like the names of cards in your soul and on your board and in your hand. So that kind of thing next to Shoujo Doji, where you need to have a lot kind of optimized to get things going the way you want it to. But yeah, okay, we'll touch on Fergilla. Man, that's just the thing with me and Dragon Empire. Like, I forgot that deck existed. I forgot Cody Blaze existed. But yeah, what do we got for Vergilla?
Well, Vergilla, okay, well, first off, they released him and they did him dirty when he came out. Because they just released him as a grade 3 in his ride line. Nothing else. Like, no support cards, nothing. They just kind of left him high and dry. And unfortunately, he's just kind of a resource-heavy deck. You're counterblasting for your Vanguard effect to restand a grade 2. You're energy blasting to bind up one of your opponent's units or retire or something, and call a grade 2 from your drop as an activity. Then you have an order that's really good and has one entire useless point of text, which is really weird. I mean, it gives 3k power for every unit on your normal unit on your board and in your drop, so you can get a really big Vanguard attack. And then it has an effect that pretty much says that if your unit is retired by your opponent's card effects, you search your deck for a card and replace it.
I think that's, weirdly enough, I just learned that that's because in the manga that he's from, the antagonist's deck was focused on retiring during the opponent's turn, or something like that. It was so weird. It's very strange.
Yeah, and yes, it might be bad omens to come of like maybe they're teasing that they're gonna add that into the game or something. But right now it's like absolutely useless. So that's a counterblast on the Vanguard. So it's like super heavy, just got left high and dry. So really didn't get any notice until like this last week when the new trial deck came out, and it actually came out as a deck that has a full deck of support and has one of the better Regalis pieces in it right now. Don't remember the name of it, but it's just really good. So it's like a must pick up deck for everyone now to even just get the Regalis piece. So it's worth talking about because the new support is actually pretty good and fixes a lot of its resource heavy problems by name blocking, counter charging, and things like that to the deck itself. So with support, it's going to be pretty fun.
Yeah, very solid pickup for new players, I think.
For sure.
Okay, now finally we can get into the last one, which is our destined one for Dragon Empire, which is actually, I think, I don't know, maybe I have mixed feelings about this deck. It's very simple in that what it wants to do is buff its rear guards and do effect damage once per game. But it also feels like it does a little bit too much of that. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm going crazy. But the numbers this deck puts out is maybe a little too much for how little it asks of you beyond a Soul Blast 2. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the Soul Blast 2 really only gives 5k to 3 units, which doesn't sound like anything crazy, but when the effects on the cards, give themselves 10k power on most, like all of your grade 1s get the plus 10k power. Then like your grade 2 is your restander, and your grade 3 just gets a little bit of power and draws a card for energy blasting. So, yeah, it's kind of weird because I feel like it is the only deck that I own, other than a Stride deck to preface, that I want to go second in. Because its Divine Skill is locked to grade 3, which allows you to choose 5 units, deal a damage, and you get power for, all of, choosing the 5 units. So you can really build a board early, hit really hard, disrupt your opponent early by taking, forcing them onto a damage that they don't want to take. And like just hitting them really hard and saying, hey, you're gonna either get to 5 or you're gonna burn a lot of your hand this turn and disrupt you into your next turn. And then when you get to your Persona Ride turn, you already just kind of get that enough innate power by giving your grade 1 the boost, the power, that it's really inconsequential to force your divines early. So I just kind of a pretty overall decent deck. It can be kind of quick.
I didn't think about that. Yeah, that is true. Just going second and kind of pushing a bunch of power onto your opponent with the effect damage. Like, if their hand isn't built up enough sufficiently by the end of their turn 3, that can really kind of swing the tempo way back into your favor just from going second. That's interesting. I think that gives me a bit more to think about with this deck. It's so relatively new, but I know it is another one of those good decks out right now that you can just build out of the set it came out in and have a really solid deck from that alone. So
yeah, it doesn't require anything else. Like, I run 4 Brachio Forces in it and the Gun Cyclers from set 1 because I have them and they're just all right, but there are other commons and generics that you can put in the deck and be perfectly fine with as well. So
yeah, but with all that, what do we think about Dragon Empire as a nation as a whole?
Well, I mean, if you kind of look at it at a tournament standard rating, it unfortunately is the best nation currently. If you look at its most topping decks, you have Shiranui, you have Shiradoji, you have Varga. Like those three decks are in every tournament for a reason, because they are very good. Which kind of gives Dragon Empire a bad name because it doesn't have a lot of generic support and other things. Like everything is so specific to every individual deck. That's what makes them really good. Is that they are locked, but so it kind of means that the other decks are typically just all right. I mean, like Cody Blaze is all right. It runs generics, but when your best generic in the deck is Brachioforce, which don't get me wrong, is a very good card, it's just a 10k beater.
So default, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean there are Latifahs, but
Yeah.
she's still just a lesser default. So, yeah, it's an interesting nation to say the least. But there are a lot of fun playstyles, and just like every deck, you can win games with them. So,
yeah. So with that, if you watched all the way through, thanks. If you like this kind of content, like the video, and if you want to keep up to date with all the other stuff we pump out, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you're notified as soon as that happens. And leave us a comment about your favorite Dragon Empire deck, or any maybe obscure one we may have missed, like a certain dinosaur that we literally never mentioned at all. So we'll let Trey live with that one, because we definitely don't have time for it now. But yeah, until the next one, I was Cole.
And I was Trey.
And we'll see ya.